Jupiter, the second stop is 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 Jupiter. All out for Jupiter!
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Cambridge Hot Club on October 8th, 2025. And I'm very fortunate to have with me Allan Chase. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Very honored to be asked.
It's an honor to have you. One of the, thank you, Suzanne. Allan says hello, but there's only one keyboard. And I'm the master of the keyboard.
Hello,
So,
everyone.
and Bill and Arthur, welcome. And we'll just get talking just shortly. But what did we say we're going to start with? Planet Earth?
Yeah, Planet Earth, I think.
Okay. So this is Sun Ra Visits Planet Earth. What year was this recorded roughly?
I am thinking, well, I want to be precise. I used to know. So give me a second.
Well,
50.
I can go grab. Now, one of the nice things about the pre-virtual world is we had. See, I think I have the record. Well, actually, I haven't pulled out my CDs.
November 1st, 1956. Older than I thought. By a year or so. Yeah. Okay.
It's interesting you say, oh, Bill, piece we just heard was Rocket Number 9.
Mm-hmm.
That's also from the 1950s, I believe.
I think that one is it 60? I guess I should have the, oh, I do have this. I know.
And actually, I have everything.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because you say that
Get serious here.
1956 or 1966 or 1976, music was extremely similar,
Mm-hmm.
decade to decade. Okay, but let's go to Planet Earth now.
Yeah. Rocket number 9, 60 or 61 around there. Yeah. 60.
Planet Earth.
Planet Earth, 1956.
And that piece is called Planet Earth from the album Sun Ra Visits Planet Earth. Welcome, everybody. And we have a question from Arthur Schwartz. When did Sun Ra become Sun Ra?
I'm going to answer some of these questions to the best of my memory, but there might be like plus or minus 1 or 2 years because I kind of finished doing the research I did on Sun Ra in 1992. And I'm a little rusty on some of the details, but I think it was 1952 when he legally changed his name to Le Sonier Ra, or something like that. L-E space S-O-N-Y apostrophe R space Ra, and started using the name Sun Ra as a stage name. And when he was asked about it, he said a lot of different things that are all related and interesting about why that name. And he connected it to the name Alexander, so ancestor, Alexandra, and sun meaning S-U-N, S-O-N, sound in French and Spanish, and R and L being interchangeable. You know, there's all kinds of, it's a long subject, but yeah, he legally did change his name, early 50s. Yeah.
He was quite young when he started studying music.
Yes.
I recall.
Well, yeah, he started playing piano as a child. Piano was in the house. I think his sister took lessons and he didn't, but he said he could play it instantly or immediately. Of course, nobody is around to describe how that went down, but this would be, you know, in the mid 1920s or early 1920s. He went to college, Alabama A&M, and studied music, or I don't know if he's an education major or a music education major. I think music education. And he had a teacher there, and I found evidence of that. I mean, I got, you know, written access to 1934, 35 like yearbook from the school that listed his name and his teacher that he described. Can't remember. It was spelled different ways in different interviews. Lula Randolph or Randall. I think it's Randolph. And it even had the curriculum, and it was quite contemporary. Like he studied Scriabin and, you know, some pretty music that wouldn't necessarily be part of the first and second year curriculum at every undergraduate college. So that's pretty interesting. You know, it's a sophisticated teacher from Washington, D.C. who knew a lot. So
you can also tell from kind of the broadness of his, I don't know, do you remember we talked about Doc Adams the other day?
Yeah.
And probably the one thing I remember from the Doc Adams book is after school, he would go to a music store, sheet music store, and he would spend 2 or 3 hours just studying scores.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there wasn't very much radio as a kid.
Yeah.
And
yeah, libraries and music stores, you know, were hugely important, and magazines too. There was a lot of published, you know, pretty accessible information to people, and so many people played the piano in those days.
Right.
Yeah, he grew up around, I guess it was a restaurant or cafe that had a jukebox, and so he heard that, and he heard bands and concerts as a kid and so on that were touring with his mother and grandmother and stuff. So he was exposed to a lot of music, and he was friends with a number of people who went on to become famous jazz musicians, like members of the Erskine Hawkins band, Avery Parrish, who wrote After Hours, the most quoted blues piano thing in the world, probably, and so on, were friends of his as a teenager.
Anyone have any questions before we go to music? And if there's music you want to hear? Got about 2,000 minutes of Sun Ra in this room. Okay, let's go to Saturn right now. Oh, go ahead.
Can I sing? Um, I remember, this is Justin Freed. Hi, guys. Great to see you. Bob Blumenthal sends his regards, and he remembers you, Allan, giving him so much information about Sun Ra. Do you
Uh,
remember that event?
I do. Yeah, I've had some conversations with him about it. Yes, absolutely. One of the,
And he's going to be checking out this video on the YouTube. He wasn't able to be here tonight. Anyway, I have a memory I'd like to share. Back when I was in school, I was on somewhat friendly terms with Tom Wilson, and I was over at his place one day. This is the fellow who started Transition Records, and he pulls out this album cover and he says, "This is a new artist. I'm going to release his music, and his name is Sun Ra." And we said, "What? Who is that?" And he was very, very excited about it. So I'm wondering if you have any comments about that particular record.
yes, absolutely. I mean, that is fascinating that you knew Tom Wilson. And, you know, Justin, I don't know if you remember this, but when I wrote my gigantic, overblown master's thesis on Sun Ra in 89 to 92, I talked to you because you were the only person who could tell me about the movie, which was thought to be lost at that point, the Space is the Place movie. You know, it was later reissued on VHS and DVD just shortly after I finished my stuff. But Justin showed that movie, right? In
Yes, yeah, and actually, I got a chance to meet with him because the distributor brought him into town. Maybe there was a gig that went along with the showing of the movie because I remember in his hotel room, there were a lot of his band members hanging out with him as Bob Blumenthal came along to do an interview for the Phoenix, I think, one of those papers. And he still has that interview, he told me. He still has that got printed. I was amazed that he was able to somehow listen to Sun Ra and make sense of what he was saying and then write a piece about it because I really wasn't able to follow what Sun Ra was exactly saying. But
yeah.
it was a lot of fun for me and it was a great time. And I enjoyed playing the film at my theater, which was the Kenmore Cinema. It was a little art house I ran.
Yeah,
So that's my story.
since that movie was so far hard, I know we're not on your question, but I'll get to it. But the film was legendary, but I couldn't see it, you know, and I'm trying to do this research. I mean, all the research I did was it was the worst possible time because it was right before the internet and right before the reissues on evidence and right before these films were rediscovered and came back out and so everything. So I had to rely on people's memories of the film, and they had all seen it at the Kenmore Theater, thanks to you. So about Tom Wilson, and I wish I had known to ask you about Tom Wilson because he's a mysterious figure. There's been some articles about him. Somebody was saying they were going to make a movie about him, which I think would be fascinating.
Mm.
Um, I've heard that he was uh, president, maybe, or founder of the Young Republicans at Harvard, which sort of shocked me, given his recording Odetta and Sun Ra and Cecil Taylor in the mid 50s, you know. Uh,
Mhm.
and but that might have meant something quite different at that time. And and we said we weren't going to get into politics, right? Yeah, we aren't. So it's just an observation. And So Tom Wilson, who a lot of people know, went on to produce Frank Zappa, Bob Dylan's like Rolling Stone, the famous comment that Al Cooper didn't know how to play the organ. He had really helped Sun Ra when he moved to New York. But back in the 50s, when he started that label, yeah, it was really like a small alternative underground kind of label. And all they recorded that I can name right now. I think there's a few more records, but there's Odetta, Cecil Taylor's first recording, and Sun Ra's first issued recording, although he may have been, I'm a little vague on the exact timeline of the Saturn records that were self-produced they were close to the same time. I don't know the release dates and all that. There were some 45s and albums, an album that might have come out very close to the same time as the transition record, but it was reviewed in Downbeat very negatively by Nat Hentoff. And he wasn't, I think he was put off by the very extensive booklet that was inside the record, like many pages of stapled text from Sun Ra, maybe 10 pages, something like that. I finally got to see it at the Institute of Jazz Studies back when I was doing this research. But it's an amazing, amazing record. I mean, it was bought by, I hope I can remember names, Bob Kester, who ran the Jazz Record Mart in Chicago, and he put it out on Delmark, a reissue, and that's how most people heard it. Like, it was in my college library at Arizona State University. You could go in the music library and listen to Sun Ra, Sun Song, but it was originally called Jazz by Sun Ra, I believe is the name of it on a transition. And you know, it still stands out as an amazing record. Bill was asking me how I got into Sun Ra, and I don't want to talk too long here. There it is.
Wow.
The reissue, yeah. But and Suzanne, who's here, knows this person as well as I do. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, as a person interested in jazz, there was really one of the handful of greatest musicians that we ever got to meet there was a man named Prince Shell. And Suzanne interviewed him, wrote articles about him, knew him well as I did. And Prince Shell went to DuSable High School with half of the Sun Ra band. Like, they were his best friends. And so we knew him growing up in Phoenix. And so when we learned about Sun Ra, we found out Prince Shell knew John Gilmore very well, and Julian Priester and Ronnie Boykins, and all the early members of the band were friends of his. And Prince Shell wrote one of the arrangements on that album, but he's not credited for it. I have it in his handwriting. It's Possession. It's a standard, or not, it's a super obscure tune called Possession by Harry Revel. And it's on the first Sun Ra record. It's a feature for John Gilmore. It's some older, before there was really good research on Sun Ra, people said, this shows that Sun Ra could write like Tad Dameron. Well, Prince Shell could write like Tad Dameron. I mean, Sun Ra is a great composer, and I'm not going to take anything away from him, but that wasn't really his style. That was Prince Shell's chart, and Sun Ra added one part to it. He added one horn. When I asked Prince Shell, I said, why didn't they give you credit? He said, well, Sun Ra added, a trombone part or something to it. So, it's really not mine. And he was a very, very, very humble man. So he just didn't want to argue about it. But that was his, a rare example of Prince Shell's writing in issued records. There are some others. But he had a lifelong career in jazz, Prince Shell, and remained friends with all of these people from the original Sun Ra band, and also a lot of the AACM people. He knew Muhal, Richard Abrams, and all those people. So that was one of the ways we got into Sun Ra, was knowing him.
Was John Gilmore with him at the beginning?
Close to the beginning, but not when the band started as a trio with Sun Ra and Pat Patrick, father of Governor Deval Patrick, of course, and a drummer. Maybe that was Robert Barry, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And yeah, I think it was. And they were called the Space Trio. And then they gradually added more horns, most of whom were people who had gone to DuSable High School, which had the best music program of any of the Southside Chicago high schools. It was, I don't know if it was technically a magnet school, but it effectively was like a magnet because of this great teacher, Captain Walter Dyatt. And Nat Cole went there, and Dorothy Donegan, and
Johnny Griffin.
Johnny Griffin, right? Gene Ammons, all the way up to Richard Davis and many great musicians from Chicago went to this school, and it was a rigorous program, and the students had gigs at night, and the teacher helped them get gigs and stuff like that. So that was a huge thing. And some of them had gone into the military and then come back, and that's what happened with John Gilmore. He had been in the Army or Army Air Force or Air Force, I'm not sure which, like right around the time of the integration of the Air Force, and he came back to Chicago and he was going to work in the post office, and he started rehearsing with Sun Ra and became, I would say maybe the most important member of the band, personal opinion, but, wonderful, important soloist and voice in that music. So pretty early on though. Yeah. They started recording in 55, 56. So John Gilmore was already in the band slightly before that.
There was the CD set that came out about 15, 20 years ago, singles.
Yeah.
And that's all the first.
That's pretty much the first stuff.
Early 50s.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have it in front of me, but I have to say, I want to say, like,
I have it in the box.
there are
behind
lots of
us.
experts on Sun Ra, and there's been a huge amount of now I have a shelf of books like about 3 feet wide about Sun Ra. When I was doing my research, there was no book on Sun Ra. The only book I could get was Tillman Stahl's discography, which was completely wrong, but it was the best a human could do at the time. And it was in a hand painted binder, and I paid like $50 in 1988 for it and sent to Germany for it. And it was handmade. That was the only book on Sun Ra. There were some chapters, by Valerie Wilmer. Thank you, Suzanne, for giving me Valerie Wilmer's book. And when I was a young person. Anyway, now there's tons of information on Sun Ra. I can't even read it all. It comes out so fast.
In your research, was there anything in newspapers, local magazines in Chicago?
I didn't have the money to travel, but I went to the Institute of Jazz Studies, which had a great clipping file, and Dan Morgenstern helped me a little bit, and other people there, Vincent Pilotti, that I think his name was.
Vincent Pilotti,
He's helped me with the old recordings and clipping file and Walter Allen's Hendersonia book and a bunch of things that I wouldn't have known about without their help. So I did find a lot of old stuff, and I did the best I could. Yeah, but I'm sure I didn't find all the local Chicago stuff. Yeah, or certainly not the Birmingham stuff. John Zwett is from Birmingham, and he, I believe, and at least he lived there. I think he's from there. Yeah, and so when he wrote the biography at the same time I was writing my thesis, we met during that process, and he did a great job with many things that I couldn't really find out about. But I'll share what I can remember. So yeah, Lafayette Gilchrist, right?
Okay, let's go back to music. Suzanne has requested We Travel the Spaceways. So
Yes. All right.
That was called Calling Planet Earth.
Yeah, we heard We Traveled the Spaceways and then Calling Planet Earth, both from late 1962, early 63, the album When Sun Comes Out. And
And he featured on Calling Planet Earth was our former governor's papa, Mr. Pat Patrick.
yeah, fascinating. So a couple things I want to say about that. This is late 62 or early 63. If you listen to what else was going on at that time, for example, in New York, in the emerging free jazz scene, I mean, there were definitely people exploring new sounds on the saxophone, but they were right there on at the leading edge of what was happening. Like Albert Eiler's famous recordings, really like what we think of as that kind of playing. It's really more of like a 1964 thing, I think. It's arguable, but anyway, the Sun Ra band was experimenting. They weren't reacting to it; they were leading it, I think. And I think that's and Pat Patrick is not often thought of as one of the innovators of that. But as I dug into these recordings, I thought, well, I mean, he might be one of the very first people to do this kind of overtones, scrambled, free time, gestural, explorational kind of playing. It's hard to put it into words. I'm a saxophone player, I don't know how to put it into words, but it's a whole complex of things. But they're like they're the beginnings of a language of a kind of free playing that I think is really different from even what well, it's right in there with what very young Archie Shepp, Albert Eiler were doing. Eric Dolphy's a little different. He was certainly pushing forward, in the year before that, into new things as well. And of course, Ornette Coleman. There are moments of Ornette Coleman, like Focus on Sanity, certain tracks where he kind of goes in that direction, but it's not like whole solos like we just heard there. I think there's several tracks like that. It's really interesting. And then John Gilmore, very close to that time too. And Pat Patrick left the Sun Ra band before they moved to New York. He went to New York before them. They were still in Chicago. He went there and worked with Mongo Santa Maria. He was trying to make a living. The Chicago jazz scene was really hurting in the early 60s, ironically, tragically, because of the integration of the Chicago Union, belatedly. Actually hurt Black musicians in Chicago quite a bit. There's a great book about that called Union and the Black Musician that I learned a lot from, and then found that same theme in a lot of interviews, that when the union integrated between the formerly segregated unions, a lot of gigs that were kind of carved out for the African-American musicians were no longer protected in a way. So it actually didn't help them immediately. It was a tough time, and a lot of people left Chicago. And so Pat Patrick went to New York. He was playing with Mongo Santa Maria. He recorded his tune. What's the one Georgie Fame did? What's the anyway? I'm blanking on it right now. But it was the same time Mongo Santa Maria did Watermelon Man while Pat was in the band and stuff like that. So he was kind of like a hit working band. Somebody knows that song, what I'm talking about. Something like, hey man, yeah man, hey, what's the name of that song? Anyway,
I thought it was fascinating, by the way, that Pat Patrick's was one of Monk's last saxophone players.
yes, on tenor. Right.
When I had never heard that before, and it blew my mind what you just played.
Yeah, he played. So among the I'll just tell this little anecdote about, it's a lot of facets to how I got into Sun Ra. And Suzanne mentioned that we saw him at Arizona State University. I was playing a gig with Lewis Nash on drums, and we came in our tuxedos, and Suzanne was already in the audience, but we thought we were going to miss the gig and maybe watch them pack up. But no, they played for like 4 hours in this college concert, which they didn't need to do at all to get paid. They played about 2 concerts worth of music. We got to this hall at Arizona State, Neeb Hall, like a 500-seat lecture hall with a stage, and saw hours more of Sun Ra. And then Sun Ra held court. He just sat down in a chair at the back of the hall, and talked to us for a good hour. This is in November 1978. I remember being in the men's room, and I was at a urinal next to two of the saxophonists on either side. I didn't know who they were yet. I didn't recognize them. And I said, "You guys played a long time. I'm so grateful," because I couldn't hear the beginning. And they said, "When you're in the middle of brain surgery, you don't just stop because the 2 hours are." And I love that quote. I'll never forget that. It probably was Patrick. It might have been Danny Thompson or one of the more outgoing people. It wasn't probably John Gilmore, who I met later. So then we went and sat and we just stood and listened to Sun Ra talk. I'm sure Suzanne remembers this. And we knew his music. We'd seen him on Saturday Night Live in May of that year, of course, which is when millions of people first saw the band. But I had like a number of his records and we had listened to him a lot. But they were showing the films from Egypt. They were marching through the audience. They were doing the vocals. They were doing long improvisations. They were playing swing era tunes. Everything was happening. As Sun Ra used to say, if somebody said, "What's happening?" Everything is happening. And it was. And that was an amazing event. Now, what was I talking about? Did I meet Sun Ra? So I was in front of Sun Ra for about 5 hours of him holding court, in which I was never able to say more than 3 words. I mean, within 5 to 8 feet of him, either just me or 6 people on about 4 occasions. And then I wanted to interview Marshall Allan. I'll just try to keep this short. So
It's not too late.
No, I talked to a few people. I tried to interview. I had a conversation with John Gilmore, and we talked about our mutual friend Prince Shell. He was so happy to talk about Prince Shell. And I said, "Listen, I'm writing this thesis on Sun Ra's music, and I love the music, and I really want to express my respect for it, and I want to understand it better. Could you talk to me?" And he said, "Oh no, I can't do an interview. No." And he just like backed up, and I felt bad. So I asked Marshall Allan if I could interview him, and he said, "Well, you'd have to get Sonny's permission, and I don't think that's going to happen," or something like that. So he said, "Talk to Spencer." So I called this phone number. Spencer was Sun Ra's assistant at the time. He was a character, and who was very helpful to Sun Ra. And I was told to call this number. It was at the Charles Hotel in Boston and Cambridge, like a mile from where we're sitting. And they were playing 3 nights at the Regatta Bar, 3 nights in '89. And I called the number, and Sun Ra picked up the phone. Well, I said, "Hello, this is Allan Chase. I want to talk to Spencer, please. And what do you want to know?" I said, "Well, I wanted to see if I could get Sun Ra's permission to interview Marshall Allan." And he said, "This is Sun Ra." And I didn't have a tape recorder. I didn't even have I had a wired phone. I reached a pen and paper, and he talked to me for about an hour on the phone, maybe 45 minutes. And he said, "Why would you want to interview him?" And I said, "Well, he's been in your band, for 40 years or whatever it was at that time, 33 years or something." And I thought, I'd like to ask him about his experience in the music. And he said, "Well, would you interview a baby to find out about their parents?" And I said, "No." I said, "But he's an adult, I don't know." I tried to respectfully push back a little bit. He's like, "No." He said, once somebody said my music was just jazz. They spoke without my permission, and they said my music was just jazz. And he said, "And there are forces that protect me. I don't do it, but forces protect me." And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "He's pushing up daisies now, 6 feet under." So he said, "You wouldn't want to bring about somebody's demise." He pronounced French. And I said, "No, I don't at all." And he said, I said, "Could I ask you some questions?" And it was the first time he'd ever interacted with me. Like, he had fascinatingly, I loved what he was saying, but I was in his presence for hours listening to him talk, and I couldn't go like, "Well, could I ask you about your first bass player?" I was a jazz history nerd. I wanted to know boring things about consensus reality chronology and things like that. And he wasn't into that. So, and it wasn't, his groove was not to tell me these things. But this particular time, I said, was Richard Evans your first bass player? No, Victor Sproles was my first bass player, but then he had an injury and he left, and then Richard, and then Victor came back. And, he's just like answered these things like very like things I really wanted to know. But he also sang me as spiritual. Went to the Rock to hide my face, and the Rock had said no hiding place. He sang me stuff on the phone. He told me all kinds of stuff, and I wrote down as fast as I could. I'm not a reporter. I didn't have like the chops to get it all down, but I immediately went and typed up everything I could remember that he said, and that's the best I could do. So when you said, did I meet Sun Ra? Those were the chances I had. I heard him live 25 times. I figured mostly during the period I was doing the research, but maybe like 7 or 8 before that. And then since he's passed, I've heard the band, a few times, 7 or 10 times or something like that. And I mostly was able, because he wouldn't give permission to talk to current members of the band, and I didn't want to, I mean, they wouldn't talk to me, they would talk, they were very nice. June Tyson and many other people had nice conversations with me, but as soon as it became, I wanted information, it just shut down. So they were instructed not to do that. And so, but former members of the band talked to me extensively, except Pat Patrick. I did try to interview him, and he said he was going to write a memoir. And sadly, there's no evidence that he had ever wrote a memoir. His materials are at Berkeley in the archive in the Africana Studies program, and I encourage people to visit that. But there's no memoir there. There's a lot of documentation of his time in the orchestra, though. I was going to say, so Prince Shell, so I'm playing a gig in Phoenix and Tempe, Arizona at a bar run by 2 former Philadelphia Eagles players. And in walks Pat Patrick and Mark Elf, a jazz guitarist. They're on the road with the Bubbling Brown Sugar pit band playing at Grady Gamage Auditorium that night up the street. So Pat Patrick came in. I didn't know who it was. He was with my friend Prince Shell. I didn't recognize him instantly. And Prince said, could my friend sit in? And he had his flute. He sat in, he played You Don't Know What Love Is. And I said, wow, that, fantastic. I said, let me introduce you. That was, what's your name? He says, Pat. I said, what's your last name? He said, Patrick. I said, Patrick what? He said, Pat Patrick. And I was like, the Pat Patrick? And he said, I don't know, I guess so. So then he told, and this is all apropos of your comment. He said, during the break, he said, I've played with Thelonious Monk, Duke Ellington, John Coltrane, he's on Africa Brass and other tracks from that big band album, Mongo Santa Maria and Sun Ra, and the heaviest, greatest genius in music I've worked with is Sun Ra. And that was a strong statement. That was one of the things that really impressed me. That was around 1979, I think. Yeah. So.
Now to introduce this next piece, the earliest.
Sorry, that was a long
That's
lap
not,
there.
but good. Before we play that, Arthur Schwartz asked the personnel.
What we just heard, yeah. I'm relying on Robert Campbell's amazing discography. Some of this might be slightly superseded by things that are online now. But
well, we can dig that up and put it in the chat. Let's introduce this
I'll tell you in a minute. Yeah. So what we're going to hear right now is the first item in this book of 850 pages. It's apparently the first known recording of Sun Ra playing the piano, and it's with the rhythm and blues singer Winoni Harris, recorded in I'm just going to start laughing if I look at Suzanne here because she remembers Keep on Churning by Winoni. Anyway, he was a kind of let's say kind of edgily, made a lot of very strong sexual metaphors in his records that that are kind of early R&B, 1946, Nashville. And this is Sun Ra just really holding the band together as a boogie woogie piano player. March 1946. It's called Dig This Boogie.
Well, if you ever heard the boogie the way it should be played, you love the boogie the rest of your days. Dig this boogie. Well, boogie woogie is the thing. Dig this boy and learn how to swing. Dig this boogie. If boogie woogie's really alright, you wanna woogie all the night. Dig this boogie. You dug this boogie, is it alright? Go home, baby, and woogie all night. Dig this boogie.
There's a city most people all forget. I'm in Chicago. Maybe it's just because they never met. I'm in Chicago. Buildings reaching up in the night. Towers of beauty in their mind. Skyline of Chicago. Once you get to know Chicago, you're sure to come back again to view the vastness of Lake Michigan. Waves dashing on the shore. Waves dashing on the shore. Take the outer drive, you'll enjoy the ride. Take the outer drive to the south side. Stony Island, take 3 flights of stairs up to the elevated train. The train is waiting, Jackson Park. Take the elevated train into the loop. Clickety click 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 clickety click 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 click. University. Cottage Grove. South Park. Chicago's loop. Bound for Chicago's loop. Click, 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 clickety, click, click, clickety, click, click, clickety, click, 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 click. Roosevelt. Harrison. Jackson. Monroe.
Washington, Chicago, Chicago, Midwest, Mid USA, Chicago, Chicago, Midwest, Mid USA, Chicago, Chicago, Midwest, Mid USA, Chicago, Chicago, Midwest, Mid USA. Da doom day, da doom day, da doom day, da doom day, da 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 da. No place on this earth compared to this Midwest paradise I ran. Chicago, Chicago, Midwest, Mid USA. Chicago, Chicago, Midwest, Mid USA. Chicago, USA. Hey!
Dreams come true, I know they do. If you believe in love, mine came true and yours will too. I swear by the stars above. Dreams come true, they just have to. True as the moon above. Mine came true and yours will too. If you believe in love. Dream of romance, strolling down Lover's Lane. In a trance and dream it over again. Dreams come true, they just have to prove they're so supreme. Mine came true and yours will too. All you have to do is dream. Dream of romance, going down Lover's Lane. In a trance and dream it over again. Dreams come true, they just have to prove they're so supreme. Mine came true and yours will too. All you have to do is dream. All you have to do is dream.
All right, so what did we hear there? We heard We Travel the Spaceways and Calling Planet Earth, and yeah, those had Marshall Allen, John Gilmore, Ronnie Boykins on bass, Pat Patrick. The drummer on We Travel the Spaceways might have been Pat Patrick or John Gilmore. Sometimes they would record, without the whole band there. And sometimes saxophone players played drums. Later, Pat Patrick played bass with the band on some gigs. And Danny Davis had joined on alto by the time of Calling Planet Earth, who was a very young saxophonist who very experimental and did some great stuff with the band. That period, those were 1960.
Very early
Late
60s.
62, early 63. And Thomas Bugs Hunter, one of the drummers in the band, had gotten hold of a electronic reverb unit, like an echo machine, and they started feeding everything through that, or feeding various things through it. And so that's why you hear all this kind of wow, 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 kind of wild echoes on some of those tracks that give a kind of otherworldly thing. This is after they had moved to New York, and they had access to this place, the choreographer's workshop. I think they were accompanying dance classes there to make some money, and could record things there and so on. So what we just heard now was we heard the Wynonie Harris track from November 1946. So this is possibly the very first recording of Sun Ra playing the piano. There's about 4 tracks that he's on, including Lightning Hit the Poorhouse, but Dig This Boogie seems to have the most piano on it. And then we heard Chicago, USA, which was a Sun Ra composition, I believe, as far as we know, maybe collaborative, but I think it was, and it was entered in a competition for like a new theme song for the city of Chicago. And Sun Ra worked with a bunch of vocal groups, and so I just wanted to represent that because I think some of you probably know all the stuff, but maybe not everybody. He kind of coached and rehearsed. Well, first of all, he was a rehearsal pianist at the Club de Lisa in South Side of Chicago, a gigantic show club that had big name acts, and that's where he met his childhood hero, Fletcher Henderson, and got to play piano while Fletcher Henderson, he served as second pianist with Fletcher Henderson when Fletcher Henderson was fronting the bands, conducting and so forth, and rehearsed with him. But he normally played the off nights there and rehearsed the dancers and some of the acts. And the Club de Lisa would have these incredible stage shows, which I think are probably some of the roots of Sun Ra's theatricality, among other things. They would have, I found all the history of this in newspapers and things. Someone's asking about that. So they would do like a Hawaiian themed month, and they would have, chorus line and comedians, and everything would be kind of, around the theme of Hawaii or something, or it would be around, sort of cowboy theme. I mean, literally, those were 2 of them. Yeah. And Prince Ironjaw, the calypso singer, was there, and Little Miss Cornshucks, sort of a R&B singer who dressed in like country bumpkin clothes, and all kinds of people with real specific acts that he would work with there. And so he worked with all these vocal groups as kind of their musical director, coach, arranger, pianist, producer, ones that wanted to make it. And that was then the very popular style of music, doo-wop and stuff like that. And so he worked with the New Sounds, NU sounds, Cosmic Rays, the Lintels, the Qualities, and this song, Chicago, USA, was one of those, with Roland Williams on the lead vocal. And then we heard Dreams Come True, and that is a Sun Ra composition, including the lyrics, with Sun Ra on Wurlitzer. And that's an early Sun Ra quintet, or sextet, I guess. John Gilmore on tenor, Art Hoyle on trumpet, Pat Patrick. And Charles Davis too. Yeah, 4 horns, Victor Sproles, William Cochran on drums, probably late 56, maybe November 1st, 1956 as well. He would bought a Wurlitzer electric piano, like a lot of people. Ray Charles and Joe Zawinul played it, on hit records, and he had one before any of them recorded on it, I believe, in the mid 50s. It was a new sound. He was into multiple keyboards very early. He had the Solovox little mini sort of electric organ that attached to the piano to give a different voice, monophonic thing. And then the Wurlitzer, and then an organ. And later he bought, state-of-the-art synthesizers. He was among the first for a lot of those things. So that's kind of getting ahead of ourselves. But anyway, I wanted to play a little bit of that vocal stuff, because that was part of the scene. And they had steady gigs in clubs, and vocalists would be part of the gig at Budland, which was the basement of the Pershing Hotel, with Ahmad Jamal on the first floor and Sun Ra in the basement, and other clubs in Chicago. So is there any other questions here? He was funny. I wanted to say something about humor. Sometimes a lot of people who just knew a little bit about Sun Ra would ask me, and I think they were wrong, but it was understandable with the little bit that they knew. They'd ask me, is he crazy? And I'm not a psychiatrist, but I never had the impression for 1 second that he wasn't mentally sharp and well and knew what he was doing. He had a sense of humor that on and off about what he was doing, and a very great seriousness about it. And, I think if you read carefully what he said, like, you've tried, those of reality have lost their way. Why don't you see what myth has to say? I'm not saying the exact words. I'm stumbling a little bit here, but basically he was offering the opportunity to experience, like reality hasn't been very good to us. Why don't we try believing something different? And it was pretty interesting. Yeah, Unmask the Batman is an interesting because he played on a Batman. It wasn't the original Batman theme, although I don't know what they knew, but he played on that's the record. He played on a Batman record. And this is Tom Wilson got them gigs so that they could survive. They made a jazz impressions of a patch of blue, Walt Dickerson and Sun Ra, which was a current movie to kind of market off of the movie, and this beautiful album. And this Batman thing, they did a limbo record, bending over backwards to go under a pole, that limbo dance that was popular in the early 60s. So when they were in New York struggling, living together in an apartment, eventually on East 3rd Street, that they spray painted gold on the inside. And they were struggling to survive and eating beans and, bologna and whatever. And from various accounts I heard, and not living well, but they got some income from Tom Wilson feeding them these gigs. So he's kind of wanted to say, like, in a funny way, like, I'm going to unmask the Batman. Like, I was on the real Batman record. There was a little bit of a subtext about that. Like, we are the band on the Batman record. They did some other commercial things too. It was quite interesting. I often think, like, if Tom Wilson had a little more time to make a phone call, would Sun Ra have played organ on Like a Rolling Stone instead of Al Cooper? That would have been it.
On the Batman, Al Cooper's on that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, he is. Okay. Small world. Al Cooper's everywhere. Yeah. Sun Ra and Al Cooper. They had to cross paths at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Steve Katz, a guitar, who's
Oh my gosh.
did a lot of rock.
I forgot that. I have this record. Yeah. Yeah, the horn players would get gigs. They could read. John Gilmore was a clarinet soloist in the Army. They were the original members, the people who came out of DuSable High School, and some of the others, James Spaulding and Charles Davis and some of those people. They were very solid professional musicians with all the conventional skills, as well as big experimenters. And so they could make a living doing other things or get some income of doing other things.
Did Richard Davis ever play with him?
Not that I know of, although he went to the same high school a little later. I'm just going to look at the personnel index in this discography and see if his name's in there. I don't think so, though. But he must have known them in Chicago.
Could be the greatest bass player ever.
You know what? He's listed on 5 recordings, 396. I wonder what those are. I forgot that. Sun Ra All Stars. Yeah, these were
right.
These were not like, these were put together by festivals and stuff. And so it was Don Moye, Philly Joe Jones. Right, Richard Davis is on it. You can find that online at the either West Berlin or the Montreux Jazz Festival.
Yep.
You can find a couple of videos of a band with Archie Shepp, Don Cherry, Lester Bowie, John Gilmore, Richard Davis, Clifford Jarvis, Philly Joe Jones, Don Moye. So 3 drummers. It's called the Sun Ra All Stars. They did about 5 or 6 gigs.
Yep. And they're on YouTube too.
They're on YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah, great stuff.
Amazing. Amazing to see those people in one space. Philly Joe Jones had this sort of secret free jazz thing going on. If you listen to this one track on Archie Shepp record, Blasé,
Yep.
called Tuareg.
Tuareg.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Philly Joe Jones sounding like his mentee, Rashid Ali. It's very shocking if you didn't know it existed.
Any requests from the audience? Other questions, or what song should we play next, Alan?
Maybe we should play that one. We should definitely play L is the Sound of Joy
Mhm.
and Saturn, because those are like 2 of the most important
Mhm.
compositions, I think.
Yep.
To talk about.
L is the Sound of Joy.
L is the Sound of Joy. So I have a kind of theory that this could be the first modal jazz piece. It's not quite modal, but it stays on one chord for more than 100 measures, which I don't know anything else except Afro-Cuban music that did that at this time. This is 1956. He probably wrote it in 55. And it also has like all 5 notes that are not in the key played in a row in fourths for the musicians out there. It's kind of like a precursor of the entire 1960s in 1956, or not the entire 1960s, but you know, a bunch of stuff. Okay. So we just heard first L is a Sound of Joy. That title is so, L has a lot of meanings. Like I don't know if I know what something about in Hebrew and Egypt, but there's a Sun Ra poem called that has the sentence, begins with the sentence, Israel, like Israel. Yeah. Israel. And he often talked about words backwards and L and R being interchangeable in certain languages and things like that. So
I made the assumption it was since Chicago.
yeah, like the elevated train going by their apartment, which they did live near the elevated train, and we wouldn't think it was really a sound of joy hearing those trains go by in the south side of Chicago, but that's why you can see scenes of that neighborhood in the movie The Cry of Jazz. Yeah. Anyway, that piece, that was one of the biggest things I wrote about in my thesis, which was, that I really analyzed that piece. And it starts with this sort of pastoral, diatonic major thing with a couple of jazz chords at the end. And then it goes into this ballad. And anyway, I can't go into it all here, but it sounds like there's a way that a bebop musician would harmonize it, and Sun Ra doesn't do that. And he ends up with like a D major chord over E flat and things that are a little more, they're not completely unheard of in there's moments like that in Birth of the Cool and Thelonious Monk, but it's very complex and rich harmony and chromatic. And then it goes into that bluesy baritone thing with the hand claps alternating with this really outline that's like all in perfect fourths and all the notes that aren't in the key. I mean, it's sort of like he envisioned the whole idea of static harmony, which, Kind of Blue is famous for, but 3 years later. And, the tune Milestones and things like that, 2-3 years later. And also the idea of playing outside the key, which Coltrane and Eddie Harris and all these people, McCoy Tyner, did in the 60s, and Woody Shaw and so forth. He was doing all of that within that one tune. It's really wild. And just a little side note, I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here, but Coltrane and Pat Patrick were friends. Coltrane met with Sun Ra before he left Miles Davis and signed with Atlantic Records. He listened to tapes that Sun Ra had and listened to their music. And Miles Davis's brother was in the Sun Ra circle, Vernon. He never recorded with them, but he was one of the vocalists in the scene and knew Sun Ra in Chicago. And Miles didn't ever have any kind words for Sun Ra in print, but he might have noticed some of these sounds. And I'm just saying Coltrane probably was pretty, just what I glean of his personality from people who knew him, is that he was very open and inquisitive and always learning and not judging too harshly. And he probably really took something from what he heard from Pat Patrick and Sun Ra. And Pat told me that he really tried to tell Coltrane to check out Sun Ra, and that Sun Ra told him he should leave Miles Davis, by the way, which may or may not have been a factor. Coltrane commented on Sun Ra and John Gilmore, particularly in one of his last interviews with Frank Kofsky. It's kind of famous, saying that he had checked him out. But that was when they were in New York that he really heard Gilmore play that way. So that's interesting. Then the Saturn is the tune that Gilmore, the great scene in the movie A Joyful Noise by Robert Muggy, the documentary about Sun Ra, which I always point people to, like, first, if you want to learn about Sun Ra, is listen to a couple of these old records like Supersonic Jazz or Jazz in Silhouette, and then watch that documentary, and you get a very rich and fascinating introduction. Robert Muggy's new book has this great account of making that documentary and editing it. In that documentary, John Gilmore says he was, that the reason he stayed with Sun Ra for almost his entire career, except for about a year and a half, from the early 50s up to his death, so about 40 years, 41 years, except for a year and a half, he was in the Sun Ra band and mostly living in the house with Sun Ra. He said, I was playing Saturn, those intervals at the beginning, that thing, And he said, and I just suddenly heard it, and I realized, like, I've got to make this the stop. This guy is more stretched out than Monk. Those are some of the words that he says in that great interview, which you can find online easily. And he sounds so happy saying it, just the look on his face. It was the same look I got when I mentioned Prince Shell to him, like this bright, like he was like a kid, like, really? We're going to talk about that? It's so authentic. Like he's just turned on by the music, and that's changed his life, and he stayed with it for decades. It's unbelievable.
Allan, we have two
yeah.
questions, one from
Okay.
Justin.
Yeah.
Did Cecil Taylor matter to Sun Ra? And then we'll get to your question, Arthur.
Sun Ra didn't, I read everything in print, but I think that everything Sun Ra said up to 1992 that was in English, German, or French press. And he never really said anything very complimentary about other members of the avant-garde. He said Ornette Coleman had an earth mind, was kind of like a good earth musician. I don't remember him commenting on Cecil Taylor or Paul Bley or, any of those other people. He was a member of the Jazz Composers Guild, 63, 4, around there. They formed a group, with Michael Mantler, Carla Bley, Paul Bley. Bill Dixon was probably the biggest instigator of that, I'm guessing. Archie Shepp, Cecil Taylor, and Sun Ra. I believe I have that right, that they were all members of that, which led to the October Revolution in Jazz, or it was related to that concert series and so on, that had a lot to do with free jazz in New York. But Sun Ra, he objected, according to Carla Bley, he objected to having a woman in the group, which, is not one of my favorite Sun Ra stories. Said something about, bringing a woman on a sea voyage was a bad idea or something like that, some old myth. And he never, as far as I know, he never said anything much about Cecil Taylor, and I never heard Cecil Taylor say much about Sun Ra either, now that I think of it. I think they had, they were kind of in parallel universes to an extent. It's interesting to me that the avant-garde is really not, like it's often talked about as a movement, and it was kind of a movement, but it's also very insular compared to like bebop, in which you have a record with Stan Getz and Dizzy Gillespie, or like there's a lot of interaction. There's not a lot, like you don't really hear the Ornette people playing with the Sun Ra people, playing with the Cecil Taylor people, playing with, Archie Shepp and Cecil Taylor, yes.
Don Cherry played with everybody.
Don Cherry is actually the biggest exception. That's a great point. Like he crossed over from the Coltrane scene to the Sun Ra. He did later records with Sun Ra. And he was open to everything, and obviously started with the Ornette and Steve Lacy, and he actually crossed all those boundaries. So it's not that nobody did. It's just that, and bass players often cross.
Doug Watkins,
like this bass player. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's interesting that like Gary Peacock and Eddie Gomez are on like ESP records and playing with Bill Evans. Yeah. Like those are about as opposite. Which you're not going to hear too much of that from other members of the band.
Arthur, you have a question?
Yeah, excuse me. Am I way off base in hearing that last tune certainly at the beginning? It sounded to me like 1958 Mingus.
I think there's a pretty strong overlap between 50s Sun Ra and Mingus. I think it's like the closest relationship. They even share a drummer, Willie Jones, at some point. I don't know how much they were hearing each other. I'm sure, there's a lot of evidence that Sun Ra listened to everything. And probably Mingus listened to a lot of things too. I don't know if Mingus listened to Sun Ra, because Sun Ra you had to really, really seek out Sun Ra's music before about 1965 or so. It would have been really hard to buy it. Transition was a tiny label.
But that last piece that you played with the baritone, that to me sounded like the beginning of one of the tunes.
Uh-huh.
Monin.
Right.
Not-
Yeah. Once it gets going, not the intro, but after that, that's probably Charles Davis, who was the real bebopper on baritone more than Pat Patrick was. Pat Patrick's often playing alto on some of these early things, and Charles Davis on
By
bari.
the way, does his son play an instrument?
Not that we know of.
I don't think so.
I met him a couple of times around the Pat Patrick archives and stuff, and I didn't really talk with him. I just shook his hand and thanked him for being great. He was friends with a jazz history teacher at Harvard when he was there, and then before his big legal and then political career. And so I've known about his relationship to Pat for a long time. Who he was. But I never heard of him being a musician. I mean, he might have played as a kid, but he went to Milton Academy, I believe. I don't know that much about it. It's all you can find it in the Boston Globe more than I know about it. But I don't remember ever hearing about him being particularly a musician. His father was absent a lot. Our friend Prince Shell, I just got to tell this little story, just to me, it humanizes this whole scene in another way. Prince Shell was dying of prostate cancer in a nursing home in Scottsdale, Arizona. I brought him the newspaper. He was only had a few months to live. I brought him the newspaper when Deval Patrick was elected governor. I think he was the second African-American governor in the history of the United States. And I brought it to him, to Prince Shell in the nursing home. And I said, "Did you see this?" And he didn't really know why I was showing it to him. And I said, "This is Pat's son." And he burst into tears. And he said, "I knew him as a baby. I stayed with them. I stayed in their house between the Navy and the Air Force." And, so there was a time, where the family was intact and the musicians were around when Deval was very, very young. But then his father moved to New York when he was a pretty young child, like 5 or something like that. I don't know the details, but, that's so I don't know how much, how musical, how much music was part of his daily life, Deval Patrick.
Do you know Bob Sinricope?
Yeah.
I
Little bit.
wonder if, because he's been it, I wonder if he crossed paths with Deval.
Oh yeah, Milton. Yeah, right. He was a long, long time
I'll have
music
to ask him
educator
that.
there.
Yeah.
Could be. I mean, I don't mean to assume. Maybe Deval is also a
I'll ask Bob.
incredible baritone sax player, and I just don't know it. I don't. The family kindly gave he and his sister Pat's archives to Berkeley's Africana Studies program. Bill Banfield wrote a book about Pat Patrick.
Right.
There, so you can check that out for more information about that. And he knows the family. I don't really know them. I've just had the privilege of meeting him once or twice. So, yeah. So we should go on to get out of the 50s, maybe. Should we
Okay.
move on?
Yeah.
I kind of feel like we should play Ancient Ethiopia. It's a very strange spelling of Ethiopia, sort of like deliberately arcane spelling. Number 13 there.
Yep.
So that's one of the last Chicago recordings. It's pretty long, but things that happen in this, like this has caused a lot of speculation about the relationship of the AACM with Sun Ra. But that was one of the things I really did research. And the only real connection between the AACM and Sun Ra is Phil Corin, and Muhal knew Sun Ra, but they weren't tight. I tried to interview Muhal, but he didn't want to talk about Sun Ra either. But Phil Corin was part of the Sun Ra band and part of the early AACM, trumpet player in Chicago. But most of the AACM people were away in the military or not around at the peak of Sun Ra's activity. So it was more like reputational. Then Sun Ra went to New York. When they came back, Roscoe Mitchell, Lester Bowie was in St. Louis, and so on. And so they kind of knew about each other, but kind of passed. It's a little bit complicated. George Lewis talks about it in his book quite a bit. And I'm very honored that he devotes several pages to my thesis in his book. So
What did you think about Abdullah's book?
I'm just sort of starting to read it. Yeah, it looks great. I I got to meet him, in the time when I was doing my research, and he's great musician. I think it's great that he wrote it. I'm still learning about it. So he has a course. Look this up. He's teaching a course on Sun Ra and Afrofuturism. Bill just told me about it.
I'll post that in the chat.
Yeah, online. You can take it, anyone. So ancient Ethiopia, you're going to hear them play this modal theme, sort of ancient sounding theme, and then they're going to do improvisations like this pointillistic two flute improvisation. I think it's James Spalding and either Marshall Allen, probably Marshall Allen, maybe Pat Patrick. And then they take their mouthpieces off of the saxophones and make strange sounds on the mouthpieces, which is, ultra avant-garde for the late 50s. Still in Chicago. And then they do the spoken word stuff. If anyone can understand anything they're saying, please tell me something about those that are souls, something or other. I've listened to it 1,000 times trying to understand the words. And anyway, it's really a trip. This is probably the most experimental and very appealing thing they did before moving to New York that I can think of anyway. Ancient Ethiopia.
And of course, the mouse battery is out.
Oh,
So
anybody
bear
have a
with
mouse
us.
battery?
It's in the other room. We'll get that in a second. Let's see. Okay, keep talking. Let me go
Okay.
get some batteries.
Okay. Maybe what will we listen to after that? Maybe we should talk about that. Maybe after that we'll listen to Plutonian Nights. So once I made a list of all of the Sun Ra innovations I could think of, and there are just strictly musical ones. Obviously, I'm not the person. The people who were members of the orchestra, like Ahmed Abdullah for his many years, and many others, if they want to talk about the philosophy, what it was like to play with him, and so on. I talked to people, the former members of the band who weren't continuing to have a strong relationship with it. And I got their take on what the early years were like. But, those people have a lot to say about that stuff. But from the strictly musical point of view, I'll see if I can remember some of them. Using multiple keyboards and switching them on the gig, doing free and group improvisations and things in free time, not unmetered time in a jazz improvisation related thing. These improvised non-tonal duets like the flute duet we're going to hear, the spoken word stuff, the chants, modal cadences in music, staying within a mode rather than using tonal harmony with normal functions of chords. He was ahead on a lot of that stuff, which, you hear hints of it in Afro-Cuban music, but really bringing it into things. So this tune, Plutonian Nights, is really like a rock beat, and I can't find an earlier jazz example per se. There maybe Art Farmer's tune Mau Mau, which you should definitely check out, with Monk Montgomery on electric bass, and you'll hear like what later became A Love Supreme in the middle of it. It's arranged by Quincy Jones. That's from '56, and that's like a Latin beat. That's where the even eighth notes, the chaka chaka chaka, rather than swing. But this tune, Plutonian Nights, is like jazz rock 1958. It's quite shocking to me that it was done then. Could be 59. I think it's 58. There's some wild, like he uses the extreme low register of the piano. He liked low sounds, two baritone saxes sometimes. Sometimes he has two basses, acoustic and electric basses on the same gig. And one more thing about low notes, when he had the octet at the Budland and he was working steadily, and one of his great skills as an arranger was to make a small band sound larger than it was, which is always very much valued in the music business and is great skill. He devoted one of the salaries to a timpani player. So he had 4 horns, piano, bass, drums. Oh, we need one more person. Well, he could have gotten another trumpet or something. He got somebody to play the kettle drums, right? That's a very interesting choice. And you hear them sparsely on the records. It's a lot of low notes being played. Can you move the mouse
I
now?
can move the mouse.
Okay, so we're going to hear Ancient Ethiopia and then Plutonian Nights.
Oops.
There we go. All right. So that was Plutonian Nights. And before that, we heard Ancient Ethiopia. Ethiopia. I never know how to say it. AEITH.
No, it's just said Ethiopia.
Yeah, I would think it would be Ethiopia. Yes. I know people from Ethiopia, but not ancient Ethiopia. It's an alternative spelling. So like that on every version of it, though. So
Consistent.
something was meant by that. So we were going to go. So Sun Ra, the band left Chicago and moved to New York, 1961. They went to Montreal to play a gig. They were fired. The band thought the person hiring them thought they were going to play some kind of rock or R&B music, and they decided to go to New York. Ronnie Boykin's car broke down. He damaged an axle or something. Something happened in New York, so they couldn't easily go from New York back to Chicago. And they kind of just stayed there till like about 1968 when Marshall Allen inherited a house in Philadelphia where some of them still live. And much of that time they lived on East 3rd Street. As I mentioned, I love the idea that they painted the apartment gold with spray paint on the inside. And I wonder what the landlord did after that. I'd love to go inside that apartment. I know exactly where it is, but I've walked by it. This is the coolest thing. Some of you might be really interested in this if you can find it. On Google Maps, Eric Charry, Charry, professor at Wesleyan University, has made a Google map of every location in Manhattan related to new music in the 60s.
Wow.
So you can see where Bill Dixon lived and where Lamont Young lived and where Sun Ra lived and where Yoko Ono lived and everybody who was doing experimental and new things. And it's in Google Maps. I don't have, if I can find a link, I'll send it to you.
Eric.
It's really cool. Eric, Charry. He's Arry, yeah. Charry. Professor at Wesleyan of musicology. And anyway, it's very cool. I love looking at it, and I've shown it to a lot of people, and I've walked around some of the spots. So we're going to listen now. So they moved to New York. They ended up in New York, and they got this gigs. Tom Wilson helped them out by getting them those recordings I mentioned, and they had the dance accompaniment stuff that they did, and they did do some gigs. Their first review in the New York Times by John S. Wilson was Space Age Jazz Lacks Boosters. That was the headline in the New York Times. Not a very favorable review. I don't know if that meant there was a small audience or what, but anyway, it was about 1962. But they did get some gigs. They played at a little cafes, same places that like Pharoah Sanders was a waiter, and Paul Bley and Jimmy Jufrey and Steve Swallow were playing those kind of places in the Village. And they didn't really start to get more of a following till the late 60s, that when the hippie era caught up with them, then they were playing Carnegie Hall and big festivals and colleges. The colleges started at 66. But up till then, you really needed the alternative culture to kind of get wheels and connect to the idea of Sun Ra, and that helped them reach a larger audience, I think. So there were some tough times, and John Gilmore left the band for a little while in 64 or 5 around there, and recorded with about 8 other people, and came back. Art Blakey toured with Art Blakey, etc. So this is very early in their time in New York. They recorded for Savoy, which was not really the happening label it had been in the bebop era. And they did this album, The Futuristic Sounds of Sun Ra. And on it, it seems like they immediately went farther out as soon as they got to New York. Now, there were only about 4 I can't remember the exact number, maybe 5 of them that made it from Chicago to Montreal to New York and stayed. And then they reconnected with Pat Patrick, who was already there. He remembered them showing up at his door and knocking on the door. And this track, The Beginning, This is one where Marshall Allan is playing his instrument that he calls the Morrow, Morrow, and which is a kind of hybrid of other instruments. And it's a shakuhachi with a clarinet mouthpiece. That's what it is. And Bernard McKinney, later known as Kiane Zawadi, is playing euphonium on this. He's on Freddie Hubbard's first records and stuff like that. Pat Patrick, John Gilmore, and they all play percussion. And this is probably their most avant-garde piece to date. This would be 19, I think. I'm going to say, yeah, October 61, recorded in Newark at a studio. It's called The Beginning, and it really is the beginning of some really out music. And maybe after that, we'll hear Searchlight Blues, because they still were playing tunes, including standards like Bad and the Beautiful and But Not For Me on recordings, as well as doing these very experimental and avant-garde, or maybe not. I don't like the word experimental. They knew what they were doing. It wasn't an experiment. It was new, though. So The Beginning, and then Searchlight Blues featuring John Gilmore. Beautiful track. If we can do that. All right. That was Searchlight Blues featuring John Gilmore. The last two tracks were both from uh, November or December 1961 in New York, and so different from each other. They were doing all these different things. Bad and Beautiful album has a number of standards on it, just in time and stuff like that, I think. And This Is My Beloved, one of those songs by Borodin that was turned into a show tune for Kismet or something like that. And at the same time, yeah, Searchlight Blues is just great. I think it's one of the great John Gilmore solos. And the beginning is really, I suspect when I listen to those things like the beginning and then especially Heliocentric Worlds and the Magic City, which is a whole album side long improvisational thing with no like really obvious written music, that Sun Ra was conducting the improvisation, that he was cueing people. It sounds to me like it, being a person who watched him a lot, and he did that later, of course, and from reading about it. I'm seeing turn the slider down.
Taking care of.
Okay, taking care of. Okay. So one of the interesting things related to the beginning, and maybe if we play Heliocentric next, because we played some of these next ones already, or Outer Nothingness. Let's go to Outer Nothingness. Yeah, that would be better than Heliocentric. So Heliocentric Worlds was on ESP Records, and that was, for many people, that was the first Sun Ra record they heard or got, and it's way out there. You know, it's not the kind of Mingus-like compositions and so forth. And this was on the ESP label that Bernard Stolman, you know, he made one record in Esperanto, Let's Sing in Esperanto, and then he kind of discovered the free jazz world, Esperanto being the invented, hoped for world language that would simplify and unify all the peoples of Latin and European languages into one easy to spell language or something. And Ni Cantu in Esperanto. That was his first record. And then he was a lawyer. He was Dizzy Gillespie's lawyer, among others. And he put out records of Albert Eiler, and, you know, he got into the scene, Paul Bley, Sun Ra. And these records, like this was in my college library too, the Heliocentric Worlds, you know, the music library at Arizona State University, just for an example of how widespread it was. You could find it in record stores. ESP was not super well distributed, but it was more accessible than Transition or some of these other obscure records. And so this would be, you know, 65, 6, around there. And he had several records, Heliocentric Worlds Volume 1 and 2, and then Nothing Is, which was a recording of the ESP Records sponsored New York State College tour, where they went to all the New York State colleges on a bus, or a bunch of them, with Patty Waters, the avant-garde vocalist, Burton Green on piano. Rand Blake remembers this. I just saw him the other day, and, you know, and he remembers this tour, being on the bus with Sun Ra. He played a duo with Patty Waters and solo piano in these concerts. And Giuseppe Logan, maybe, and some of these other artists that were on the ESP avant-garde jazz label. And this when Sun Ra started, you know, making it to colleges and so forth, more, and all, you know, audiences started to tell their friends about Sun Ra, and I think the audience expanded drastically, you know, leading to gigs in Europe and other things in the late 60s that were very favorable. You know, there's a lot of interesting things that happened in the period between around 66 and 69, playing at Carnegie Hall with Willis Conover as the MC from Voice of America's jazz show. Interesting gigs on this might have been in the early 60s, gigs on a ship, a ferry around New York Harbor, gigs on a pier, 1965, you know, and in the Hudson River pier. Sort of like the beginning of the hippie alternative underground scene, and after the beat scene and the free jazz scene, kind of expanding that scene in 65, 7, and so on. And some people probably remember many of these things. The elders here, I remember them from being 10 years old, but yeah, I do remember that era. Anyway, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah, amazing to see Lafayette Gilchrist here. He's playing with the orchestra. Welcome.
Welcome,
Oh,
Lafayette,
thank you. Thank you.
a current member of the orchestra.
Yes, I do have that honor.
Yeah, enjoyed hearing you. It's nice to see you. So one of the most interesting things I just want to say that's about related to beginning and heliocentric or outer nothingness that we're going to hear in a minute, which is also has a great John Gilmore solo. Really, just it's made me think so much what he plays on this thing. It's really different. And I learned here's how I learned this. I interviewed Art Hoyle, the trumpet player who was in the orchestra in Chicago, but did not leave for New York with them. He played in quite a few of the records from around 56 to 59. And he went on to have a career as a trumpet player in Chicago, I'm sorry, but also as a voiceover and spoke artist, radio personality, commercials, things like that, spoken word stuff. And very much loved person in Chicago. And he gave me a very helpful interview. And he said, well, I said, tell me about what did you do for gigs? He said, well, we had a gig. And this is mind blowing to me. Somebody needs to make a movie about this. I'm very happy to share this piece of fact. So he said, we had a gig on the North Side, which bands like ours, African-American South Side jazz bands in the Union, didn't normally do, at a place called the Compass Theater. And I'm like, wait a minute, the Compass Theater, I know about this. He said, yeah, you do know about it. It's the Second City. It's the Mike Nichols, Elaine May, Joan Rivers, Stiller and Mira, all these comedy people who were working on improvised comedy, which leads directly to Saturday Night Live and Second City. They had the Compass Theater. It was a dinner theater with improvised comedy, jazz in the middle, and then another set of improvised comedy with Sun Ra on piano accompanying the comedians.
Wow.
Nobody, as far as I remembered this, and Art Hoyle said, I said, who was in the band? He said, it was a quintet, me and John Gilmore, Sun Ra, bass and drums, might have been Robert Barry. I don't know if it was Ronnie Boykins or might have been a little bit before him, might have been, it wasn't Richard Evans because I did interview him. Might have been Victor Sproles. I don't know which bass player it was for sure, but I don't think he remembered. But he said we did this for a long time, and he said, and Sun Ra would then play for the skits that the comedians do. And if you listen to, there's a Nichols and May record called Improvisations to Music. Sun Ra is not on it. The person who followed him in that gig is Bill Matthew, who now has a Islamic Sufi name, Alauddin, I think, who is like a writer of a book about just intonation, but he also arranged an album for Stan Kenton and all this stuff. So that's who replaced Sun Ra in this gig, playing piano for Nichols and May. So there's a record that gives you an idea of what that is. Them improvising with a piano player. Piano plays some music and they just do that yes and kind of theatrical comedy improvisation where one of them states a premise like, oh, do you come here often? Oh, okay, we're in a bar, and then they go with it. Or Scalpel, and she's a nurse and he's a doctor, it's hilarious. I think it's really good. But just imagining that Sun Ra was there. So the second part of this story is I don't read French hardly at all. And I asked my friends great musicians, late Tom Cora, cellist, and Catherine Jonio, Belgian free improviser vocalist, who's still with us, thankfully, living in France. And I asked them, could you help me translate these Sun Ra interviews that are only in French, in the French jazz magazine? 1965 interview, one of his first extensive interviews in print. And it's only available in French, translated. Obviously, he was speaking English, I think. They say, where did you get this idea for free improvisation where everybody is improvising and it's not on a jazz form? He says, well, I worked with some actors who did that. And I said, if actors can do that, then I can do that. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. He directly attributed the idea of doing free improvisation with the musicians to his experience with these actors. And I'm sure he had to mean Nichols and May and all these people. So he realized they were making something up totally out of nothing. And he was already doing a million things as a jazz composer and leader, you know, very, very innovative and very visionary. And it just added one more thing. Perhaps, you know, maybe he was just latching on to, maybe it was just one of 1,000 factors in him doing that. But it's very interesting to me that that was a thing. And it's just also just interesting to think of these two worlds touching. I mean, there's a lot of cases where comedy and jazz have, and theatrical improvisation and jazz and poetry and things have touched. And that's one that I never expected to hear about. There's a lot of really good books about improvisation at the Second City and Compass Theater, which are very interesting, but there's just the tiniest trace of the history that Sun Ra was part of it for months. So they played a dinner set of jazz, you know, whatever, probably originals and a few tunes. And then Sun Ra would play the piano, the actors. So, you know, if that helped embolden him to translate that into music, it's an interesting possibility. So I guess we play, I think Magic City might be too long. It's like 26 minutes, but listen to it sometime. It's one of the greatest long improvisations ever made, I think. But let's listen to Outer Nothingness. Yeah. This is 65. World. First, we heard Outer Nothingness from Heliocentric Worlds of Sun Ra, Volume 1, featuring John Gilmore on that amazing solo that starts with like 2 half steps and then it goes, he repeats it and he moves it around. And it's like math. It's so intense and sound is so amazing. And Sun Ra is playing a bass marimba on those tracks. That's April 65. And then that was released on ESP. And as I said, it made it around the world more widely, maybe than some of his earlier things. The third thing that ESP released of Sun Ra, I believe, was Nothing Is from the live on their New York State College tour. I don't think we know which college it was recorded at. Just kind of curious. But I don't see any, maybe somebody knows. But Shadow World, they'd played it on a few previous records and it became part of the set. If you want to see something really amazing, I think this is on YouTube. I have it on a DVD. Watch the orchestra in East Berlin when there was still a East Berlin on television, black and white television, playing Shadow World. Shadow World is a piece. I'm sure must be some instructions to the orchestra that people know that I don't know, and maybe I shouldn't know. But it seems to deal with the dark side of things. And in the East Berlin version of it, there is smashing of chairs. People are rolling on the ground. There's a lot of, it's very intense. I'm amazed the East Germans put this on television. It was years before before the fall of the wall and all that stuff, 86 maybe. And it's just very interesting. So it's a piece, somebody in the orchestra, I asked about this piece, like, how is it organized? It's very complicated rhythmically. And somebody, I can't remember who it was, said, we've never played it right. And I think it's like extremely hard, but it's amazing. It always sounds amazing. But there's like some complexity to it that maybe Ken Shapworth at New England Conservatory has attempted to transcribe it and performed it. But who knows how close it is to what was really intended. At that point, the band was pretty big. They're on this bus traveling around.
Did Ken do that at the 2014
Yeah.
Sun Ra?
Yes. Yeah.
Which is, yeah. So
yeah, which I played in. Yeah, I played baritone on that.
Yeah. So that's on YouTube.
Oh, it is. Okay. Yeah. So Sun Ra, there's 2 trombones in the group, Ali Hassan and Teddy Nance, Marshall Allan, John Gilmore. Of course, Marshall Allan is still at the helm of the band on many gigs. Pat Patrick, Robert Cummings on bass clarinet, James Jackson, who I knew a little bit, friendly member of the band who played flute, bassoon, and log drums, and made the lightning drum from a tree that was hit by lightning in the backyard. Sun Ra told him to build the drum. It's in that documentary. And the next day, that night, lightning hit the tree, and he said, he made the drum out of the dead tree. The lightning struck tree. Took a long time. Ronnie Boykins is still in the band. Clifford Jarvis on drums, Roger Blank, or Jimmy Johnson, it says in here. So it's, about a 13-piece band at this point. It expanded with some New York players added to the original Chicago players and so forth. James Jackson is a big figure in the orchestra and was I think he grew up in Brooklyn. He's a friend of mine, drummer Randy Kay, knew him in high school. Randy Kay, who played with Jimi Hendrix and Jimmy Giuffre. That sounds impossible. It's just another one of those things that happened in the 60s. He was in the last band of Jimi Hendrix. I just got a recording of that. So that was released on Nothing Is, with a great album cover with the flame in front of Sun Ra's face. And that has a lot of the vocal numbers are on it. There's sort of a medley where they go very quickly through all the Sun Ra and his band from outer space will entertain you now. Theme of the Stargazers. If you find Earth boring, just the same old same thing. Come on and sign up for Outer Spaceways Incorporated. Next Stop Mars. They sing all of those in rapid succession at one point in the concert. And it's a pretty long set, if there were like 5 bands on these tour, and they must have played an hour. Must have been quite an experience to play all these colleges all around the state. So yeah, things are happening at this point. I don't know what we should play next. Do you have any thoughts? Spectrum is really minimal.
Before we go to more music, Lafayette, who's currently holding the keyboard.
Yes.
Welcome. Playing with the Sun Ra Orchestra. Great to have you here with us. You're muted. If you want to say something, you don't have to.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate being here. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, I was just saying thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Great. So glad to see you here. Yeah. You want to add anything?
How long have you been playing with the orchestra?
Well,
You're a little distorted.
I have a full year. I just joined. Better?
Hello?
Oh, hello. Is this a little better?
That's better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I'm sort of brand new. I haven't even been with the orchestra a full year.
Really? Okay. Wow. I thought.
Yeah,
Did I see you at the Drake in Amherst? Did you play that?
no, I don't think so. I think I just joined the orchestra in let's see. I think I did my first date with the orchestra in April.
Okay. Yeah.
Any gigs coming up soon?
Oh yeah, we've got a gig. We've got a gig in Mexico on October 25th, and then we've got a gig here in Baltimore on the Halloween, I believe, the 31st. And I think we're going to be at the World Cafe in December.
What city in Mexico will you be?
Uh,
There.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, but it's on the the web page. I'm sorry, the name escapes
Oh,
me.
that's okay, no problem.
Yeah,
I'll find it.
that brought back a memory. When I was a freshman in college, I was pretty interested in this music in Arizona, and I was in line at the cafeteria at Arizona State, and my piano playing friend said, "Oh, this is my friend. He was a German major, and he introduced me. She's a foreign languages major." And I met her, and she said, "So you're into jazz?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, I just had a job with a jazz band." And I said, "Oh, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, I was hired by the Mexican government to do hand massages for the Sun Ra Orchestra." This is in 1974.
Hand massage.
They had just, I'd read in
Oh.
Downbeat that they did a tour of Mexico. They played at a pyramid. It was very big, sponsored by the government and stuff. And they played at a pyramid and things like that. They played in Mexico City, big outdoor festival and things like that. And she had been paid to give hand massages to the tired musicians.
Oh,
It's crazy. So I thought that was beautiful. That was so,
Wow.
I was like, man, I'm not on the right path. I gotta do gigs where there's like
That was the 70s.
74, yeah. 74.
Oh,
Well, I met her in 74, yeah. So
oh wow.
yeah,
Mhm.
I'd love to talk to her again. Just to find out because I didn't know. I was like, wait a minute, really? At the time
Wow.
I knew somebody who knew Sun Ra, two people I mentioned earlier in this chat, Suzanne and I, who's here.
Mhm.
A musician who grew up with most of the members of the original band at DuSable High School in Chicago. And he was a pianist and living in Arizona, but from Chicago, named Prince Shell. And he wrote
Mhm.
a few arrangements that the band played, Lady Bird, Memoir of a Jug, and Possession,
Mhm.
which is on the first record. And where was I going with that? So I knew him, and through that I was interested in, that kind of had led me into more interest in Sun Ra's music and stuff. So I kind of
Oh,
knew, but we also knew a guy in Arizona named John Dixon who worked for Impulse Records. He worked for Steve Backer and Ed Michel. So when all the Impulse records were issued by that label that had previously been on Saturn and so on, and the new recordings like Astro Black, he was
mm.
in the studio with Sun Ra, and he was dealing with the business and stuff, and he was a friend of ours. So that was how that came about.
Mm.
Strange connections and small worlds type stuff.
Wow, man.
That's 50 years ago. Yeah. Maybe.
Wow.
What instrument does Lafayette play in the orchestra? Keys.
piano.
The piano.
Piano. How does it feel to fill the shoes or take be the piano in that ensemble? Like, have you studied the music for long, or you're getting it more
I
from
mean,
the other musicians?
yeah, but a combination. I mean, I've been studying the music and trying to learn. And honestly, it's been an incredible. I mean, it's been an incredible experience so far. Um, One of the veterans uh, uh, told me, he said, "Well, you're not going to really learn the music until you go on the road with the band." So now I've been on the road a little bit with the band. I feel a lot more confidence about the music, but I still feel just, I mean, this man wrote an incredible amount of music, man. And it's just, no, I still feel, I feel positive about it, but man, there's a learning curve. I mean, just because of just the sheer volume of the man's work. I feel like not even scratching the surface yet, really. But I'm looking forward to getting deeper and deeper, and each gig gets better and better.
I've seen you only play acoustic piano over the last years. So you're now playing electric with him, and
Oh yeah, I play anything they put in front of me. Sometimes we'll have an acoustic piano, and then sometimes this past tour we did 3 cities in China, and I had a acoustic piano plus a chord.
Mm-hmm. That is a cue to play some synthesizer music.
okay.
So, 1968, Bob Moog has made what is really the first synthesizer that is adapted for live performance, on stage use, flexible, just plays one note at a time. It's now called Mini Moog, that kind of instrument. And he got one of them to Sun Ra and one of them to Paul Bley. And it's just fascinating to me. He didn't give it to Keith Emerson or, some rock organ player from England or something like that. He went to two of the most adventurous improvisers who were playing the piano who might want to touch this instrument. And I already had a history playing electric keyboards. He played organ.
I'm trying to remember who told me that. I was told that. I think Noel Scott told me that.
Yeah. And so there's in the Moog Museum called the Moogseum in Asheville, North Carolina, where he ended up living.
Really?
It's right on one of the main streets there. That's mentioned in the museum. It's like his estate, turned it into a nonprofit to history of the synthesizer. And it's an interactive little mini museum downtown Asheville. It's really cool. And so Sun Ra got this instrument and did amazing things with it. You can hear it. Paul Bley made an album called Paul Bley Synthesizer Show. And he kind of plays his tunes and Carla Bley's tunes on the synthesizer. Sun Ra took it in a vast direction, and it seemed to immediately adapt to it. There's an album, My Brother the Wind. I think I'm a little confused. There's My Brother the Wind Volume 2. Seems like it was the first one, but that's Sun Ra. To me, that's like there was no Volume 1. And it's just so it puts you off on a different place because you get Volume 2, you can't find Volume 1. But that's all synthesizers. I think he might have had 2 of them because either he overdubbed or I think he's playing 2 of them. I was going to play Scene 3, Took 4. So I think there's a track on this album called Scene 1, Take 1 or something. And then this is Scene, but SEEN, like I seen 3, Roman numeral 3, but I took 4 rather than Scene 1, Take 1. So a lot of plays on words everywhere. And maybe we go from that into Astro Black, which is one of the greatest things ever, with June Tyson singing.
Oh yeah,
by Sun Ra. So Scene 3 Took 4 is got to be about 68 because it's got the synthesizer.
mythology, astro timeless immortality, astro thought in mystic sound, astro black of outer space, astro natural darkness stars, astro reach beyond the stars, out to endlessness, astro black Americans, the universe is in my voice, the universe speaks through this song to those of earth and other worlds. Listen while you have the chance, find your place among the stars, get into with outer worlds rhythm, multiplicity, harmony, equational melody, horizon speed, astro black and cosmos stars, astro black and cosmos stars. Astro Black mythology, astro timeless immortality, astro thought in mystic sound, astro black mythology.
Astro Black. Wow.
That was May 7th, 1972. That was a new recording that they did for the Impulse label, which was also reissuing as many of the Saturn records as they could. I interviewed Ed Michel, who was at Impulse at the time, about this, and they had the business story of it is very interesting. They had an incentive where they got bonuses to put out as many records as they could, and they loved Sun Ra and Sun Ra's music. They didn't care whether it sold. It did sell better than, maybe some upstairs people would have feared. It actually got a lot of attention, this great music coming out on this label, but they just put record after record after record out. I don't know how many off the top of my head now, but I can think of about 10 in a very short time, like within a couple of years. And Astro Black was the only newly recorded one that they put out in that first batch. Later, they did Crystal Spears and some other ones, which are really great. They did 4 albums in a day and a half, Ed Michel told me. Recorded enough material for 4 albums in a day and a half. This was May 1972, and that October 19th and 20th of 1972, they recorded enough for 4 albums. Unbelievable. That's one of my favorite tracks. I lived on that track when I was 16 years old, 17 when it came out. I mentioned my friend worked at Impulse, and I think we're past the statute of limitations now. He put me on the mailing list as if I was a radio station, the 16-year-old kid.
Oh, wow.
And so I would get these boxes of promos from Impulse. I got Coltrane, Interstellar Space, and Concert in Japan. And, I later played for 8 years with Rashid Ali. I first heard him because of these records. I never thought I'd meet him in a million years. And I was in one of his bands for 8 years, but I was introduced to Sun Ra mostly through hearing every one of those records. I mean, in a way, I feel like I learned something about how to play bebop from listening to those records because of John Gilmore and Julian Priester, as well as exploring all this free improvisation and all these sounds and things. So, and compositional ideas. Anyway, it brings me back. I just have to say that. Yeah, that record is very great. The Astro Black. There's other great tracks on it too. Discipline 33 or 99. 99. Yeah, there's different disciplines. Yeah. Learn more about those.
Well, Allan,
we're out
thank you.
of time.
Yeah, we're out of time. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for
Thank you.
sharing.
Very much a pleasure. We had about 5 hours of music, and we played about 3. So
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we'll share a playlist with you all.
Yeah. And come back and do another round of Sun Ra or with Rashid Ali. We haven't. He's under
an honor as well.
Yeah.
Have to digitize all his stuff. I have it all on LP, but yeah.
Well, thanks everybody, and thank you, Mr. Cliff, and everyone else who's joined us. Cliff is the grand wizard, as our regulars know. So, any questions? Any before we go?
Oh man, thank you all for having me, man. I'm sorry I got in on the late end of it, but I really enjoyed what I heard.
Thank you for being here. It's really an honor, and I hope everyone will go see the orchestra whenever they can around
Absolutely.
the world. The last shows I've seen have been fantastic, and thank you for keeping it going.
Yeah. Maybe you'll come be a guest on one of the shows next year. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another Bostonian, Ken Field.
Okay.
And hope to see you then. And we're going to go out now with, did we say the Magic City?
Sure.
Or
okay.
satellites are spinning? We'll
Do
do
you
the
want a
magic.
long one or a short one?
We'll do the long one.
Magic City is 27 minutes
Yep.
of really brilliant.
Yep.
That's Birmingham, but it's, I think, beyond Birmingham.
Yes.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, good night, everybody. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Same station.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan.
Take care.
What a pleasure.
Very much so on my part.